I rose to a point of order and I asked the Speaker of the House, I said, I would like to know before I vote on what basis this vote is being taken, because the court has determined that
there are inconsistencies.
There are inconsistencies. And also I would like to know if the government is proposing amendments to the bill, then certainly I would like to know what those amendments are before I would vote. Parliament erupted, we say there is very little space to make your arguments, where people actually listening and trying to engage you. The government responded saying that we will consider amendments at the second stage, at the committee stage. But I think there was a fundamental flaw in that argument, because if it is a usual bill, you entertain amendments at the committee stage. But when something is inconsistent with the Constitution, we need to know upfront whether that is going to be corrected. That needs to be known upfront. Because look at it hypothetically. I might want to vote with the government on the bill, but how can I support something which is inconsistent with the Constitution without at least knowing that the government is going to make it consistent with the Constitution? So that was my fundamental problem. But the Speaker ruled that the amendments will be entertained at the committee stage. I do not agree with the ruling of the Speaker. The Speaker is not infallible, and therefore I do not agree with his ruling. But certainly in the tradition of parliamentary democracy, we have abided by the ruling.
You have to admit, though, that the government, in terms of small and medium enterprises, through the 2013 budget, the World Bank has identified SMEs as the engine of growth for Sri Lanka. And the government has also done some good things in terms of providing for these small and medium entrepreneurs. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that the SMEs are the heartbeat of the Sri Lankan economy, and I think the government is now trying to give it some recognition, and I think it's an important recognition to be given, because SMEs have been long neglected. There has been some feeble attempts at helping SMEs through financing provided by multilateral agencies, distributed often through DFCC, NDB, and some of the other commercial banks. But that has been, I would call that a feeble attempt, right? And you need a much more comprehensive approach to SMEs. As you noticed from the recent budget, the government tried to give some leverage on the taxes to the small and medium industries. Whereas I know that those who run their supermarkets may be concerned that some of the burden was coming on them. So I think that this is obviously, there are pros and cons in this. There are pros and cons. SMEs in some sense are disadvantaged, because I've been talking to small business people, boutique owners, in and around the city. And often their complaint is that they have to obtain their goods through distributors, and they don't get it directly from the producer or the big.
When they have to go through middlemen, they tend to have to pay a much higher amount than the supermarket.
That's right. They don't get it directly, for example, even from a multinational or a large local producer. So they don't get that corporate discount, as if it were, because it comes with the cost of the distributor who gives it to them. And their argument is that then the supermarkets do get some of these advantages, because they bulk buy, they can deal directly with the supply and so forth. The other thing that we need to remember is that SMEs is a huge employment creator in the country. You go to every nook and corner in this country, there are the small shops. These are family-run businesses. Thousands and thousands of people are employed. This is their livelihood, and they have to be supported. I would say it's very critical that they are supported, particularly given that since 2005, this government's economic development model has become a statist development economic model. The emphasis is on the state. If you look at employment, private sector employment in the last 5 years has almost been stagnant, not grown.
Whereas the public sector employment has pretty much ballooned.
It's the public sector employment that has ballooned, and that's not because the public sector is adding to the GDP. It's because this is the way that government is buying the social peace by actually giving letters of appointment, which are unrelated often to the growth of the GDP or productivity, right? And that's the way they are keeping the social peace, because of the statist economic model. So the private sector hasn't been encouraged actually to grow, to invest. The confidence is not there. If you look at exports, right, exports from a decade ago have almost halved because the incentives are not there for the exporters.
That's another topic that I want to touch on, Mr. Wickramaratne. And as soon as we come back from this short commercial break, we'll have more on the trade deficit and whether the government can maintain growth rates with the current provisions in the budget. Welcome back to Biz First in Focus. Before we left you, we were talking to our guest, Mr. Eran Wickramaratne, the Honourable Eran Wickramaratne, about the trade deficit in Sri Lanka. Now, some measures have been taken through the 2013 budget to bring down to bridge the trade gap somewhat. But do you feel, if I were to state that rather than promote the creation of a better export base, it's simply a matter of restricting imports? Do you agree with that statement?
I'll be more worried about this suggestion that we should restrict imports. I would certainly say that, unnecessary imports, luxuries and so forth, we could tax them higher, you see, so that imports are necessary, particularly intermediate goods, going into manufacturing and things like that are necessary so that we could add value and re-export them. I think what really lacks is the exports. If you look at it, apart from our traditional exports, tea, rubber, coconut, the garments and the more technological exports are basically going to Europe and to the US. Sri Lanka's foreign policy doesn't seem to complement its export policy, and I think that's one of the issues. We seem to be forging our relationships with the countries from which we are importing, whereas as a strategic initiative, I would say that our foreign policy needs to be aligned to countries which we are exporting.
It's very interesting that you're saying that, because very recently at the Apparel Exporters Association, they had the annual general meeting recently, and the past chairman was suggesting reopening the dialogue with the European Union on getting back the GSP Plus concession, and the new chairman of the association was actually saying that the concerns of the apparel industry, which make up about 40% of the country's export industry, are not being addressed.
He is right, because you talked about GSP. It is true that countries put undue pressures on Sri Lanka, particularly during the conflict, particularly on the economy and on the trade side. That's not to take away from Sri Lanka upholding its international commitments, particularly in terms of human liberties, human rights and things like that, but undue pressure on the trade side, and that's a time in which we basically had to give up our GSP. But it's 3.5 years since the war has ended, and we should have been applying for our GSP. I heard somebody in the chamber say the other day at a forum that we lost probably $1 billion by just not applying for the GSP. I think we have to have a sensible policy. Politics is driving economics, and that does not work in the long run. You see, the economy must take precedence, and if we want our exports, if we want to maintain our lifestyles, if we want to create new jobs, if we want to stop our youth from either getting on a plane or getting on a boat and leaving this country, we need to do something. I think we have to get off this idea that the whole world is against us, and therefore somehow or other we are being persecuted, and therefore we can't do anything about it. I think we have to take our destiny to our own hands in a sensible manner. The youth of this country needs to be given hope. I dare you, do a survey, you go out and talk to the youth out there and ask them what hope they have. The education system is in shambles, right? Everybody knows that. Right? There is no spending on education. Right? The government is again playing with statistics. It's trying to say that
But in Parliament now, the Minister of Higher Education, the Honourable S.P. Dissanayake, he said that if you look at all the allocations that have been made for education, research and all that, it's quite a sizable amount.
I can tell you with responsibility, if you take the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Higher Education and expenditures on education through the provincial councils, we are spending 1.5% of our GDP. I told Mr. Honourable Dissanayake yesterday while the debate was on, I said you made a valiant attempt to add every bits and pieces and you brought it up to 2.5%. But it's really under 2%, right? But we have signed, right, in UNICEF meetings we have agreed that there should be a government allocation of 6% on GDP, or we should be moving towards that. We are nowhere near that, right? The spending on education keeps coming down. In fact, the 2013 budget spend on education will bring the percentage of GDP investment on education down in 2013 from 2012. So again, people are just playing with numbers and with statistics, but the fact of the matter is the public investment program, which is 6% of the GDP, 90% of that is still going into infrastructure and into roads. We are not investing in soft infrastructure, we are not investing in education, we are not investing in health. The long-term implications of this will be felt in another 10 to 20 years. It was because of the investments in education in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, we reaped its benefits in the 70s and in the 1980s. Because of what we are doing now, in 20 years from now, when the history of education and economy is going to be written, we could say the failure of this education policy has basically resulted in what Sri Lanka is going to be.
Before we're running out of time, so we have to wrap up. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, the fiscal responsibility of Parliament. You were saying that Parliament cannot abdicate its fiscal responsibility. But forgetting party politics, looking at the current financial straits of the country, if I were to say that our MPs, our more than 200 MPs in Parliament, as individuals, not as whichever parties they're affiliated with, have abdicated their responsibility, would you agree?
I wouldn't completely agree with that statement, right? Every day we go to Parliament, we sit in the chamber, we go to committees. I could say, I sit in COPE many days in the year. I sit in COPE, basically talking to public officials, corporation chairmans, boards, looking through their financials. We certainly have a responsibility, and I would admit that we cannot completely fulfill that responsibility in the present structure. For example, the Sri Lankan Parliament doesn't have a standing committee on the budget. So the first time we hear about the budget...
Now this is an issue now. On last week's show, the former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Chanda Jayaratne, we spoke at length about this, the need for a standing committee on the budget. Why is it so important?
It's important because, first is, before you get into the appropriations, you have an idea what the appropriations are, and there's a discussion. When it comes to expenditures, right, in a committee, in a small group, you could actually examine the expenditures very much more carefully. Now there is no monitoring system in Parliament. You have constitutional responsibility for full control of finances, but you don't have the institutional framework to actually monitor what those finances are. I was a CEO of a bank, and we would have daily reports, weekly reports, monthly reports, and then we could basically call for meetings, we could make adjustments as we go. Parliament doesn't have such a mechanism, so the standing committee will help. In a committee, we could also call experts in to come. We could ask them to give their views, they can testify before the committee. We can incorporate that expert knowledge into the process. The other good thing about committees is that it could work in a bipartisan way, unlike the plenary in Parliament. So it could be an added thing. I would even go further, that we could empower the committees where it could actually move the amendments to the bills, even initiate legislation, which would then become basically through a process, informed process, bipartisan, joint legislation, joint proposals in the national interest. So I think there's a lot more that could be done to make it meaningful that parliamentarians have not abdicated their responsibility in finances.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on BizFirst in Focus, Honorable Wickramaratne. It was an absolute pleasure having you with us. I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you.